Good morning, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming today. I'm Shihoko Goto. I'm the Senior Associate for Northeast Asia with the Wilson Center's Asia program. For those of you who are joining us online, welcome. We are live webcasting this event, and it will be available online as well as a recording at a later date. There's really never a bad time to talk about North Korea, and it seems particularly timely today to be having a discussion about Pyongyang given the latest missile testing. But our focus today is not about the capabilities of North Korea or its supposed endgame, but rather it's to focus on the history and the backdrop of relations between North Korea and Russia. And I'm very excited that we are able to have this very timely event together with FPRI, the Foreign Policy Research Institute of Philadelphia. The Wilson Center's Asia program has been very fortunate enough to be able to host joint conferences with FPRI over the past few years. And I really want to thank Alan Luxembourg in particular for giving us this opportunity to have this event. And so with that, I would like to invite Alan to introduce the speakers.
I want to also thank Shihoko and the Asia program of the Wilson Center. It's always nice to be here with them. Since FPRI is a Philadelphia institution, some of you may not be all that familiar with it, so let me just say in a sentence or two that we were founded in 1955 on the premise that a nation should think before it acts. It was good advice then. It remains good advice today. We look at contemporary international affairs through the lens of history, geography, and culture. And as one of my colleagues likes to say, we study the realities and mentalities of the localities. Today's program is the culmination of a year-long research project which FPRI has conducted in collaboration with scholars from the Far Eastern Federal University, the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. The project has been led by Renz Lee and Art Lukin. Renz Lee is a longtime senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the author of several books, among them Smuggling Armageddon, which is about illegal nuclear trafficking from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and more recently a book on the geopolitics of the Russian Far East, which he wrote with Art Lukin. Renz is to my left, Art is to Renz's left. Art is the Deputy Director of Research for the School of Regional and International Studies at the Far Eastern Federal University in Vladivostok. Chris Miller, third down the line on this table, who is the research director of our Eurasia program, also played a critical role in supporting this project. We have just posted yesterday on our website the two major reports that are up for discussion. The first report will be discussed here on panel 1 and the second on panel 2. The report also includes a scintillating foreword by Paul Bracken, one of the leading experts on the management of nuclear forces. So with that, let me just ask you to turn off your cell phones before we begin, and I'll ask Renz to take it from here. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Al. I'm supposed to be introducing the speakers. Before that, I would like to just say a couple of words what this conference is about. We're going to look at Russian-North Korean relations through the lens of the ongoing nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. As many of you know, Russia has long been a forgotten player in the Korean nuclear drama, but this is beginning to change. I think a few enlightened policymakers are beginning to think that Russia, maybe, just maybe Russia, could play a useful role in brokering a negotiated settlement to the crisis. I realize this is a long shot, it's a controversial idea, but anyhow, an idea that we explore at some length in this project. We'll be talking about this today. Let me go through the introductions again. Artyom Lukin is Associate Professor and Deputy Director for Research of the School of Regional International Studies at the Far Eastern Federal University in Vladivostok. He is one of two principal investigators of the Russia-North Korea project. As Ellen mentioned, he co-authored with me of the recent book on Russian Far East, New Dynamics in Asia Pacific and Beyond. George Tolaraya is director of the Asian Strategy Center at the Institute of Economy of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He's also professor at the Moscow State University of International Affairs. Dr. Tolaraya is considered one of Russia's leading experts on North Korea. We also have a couple of commentators. I'll introduce them now. Chris Miller is research director of the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Also, he is assistant professor now at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And Chris currently is writing a book on the history of Russian diplomacy in Asia. And last but not least, Ben Silberstein is an associate scholar at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and doctoral candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, writing what looks like a very interesting dissertation on the history of surveillance and social control in North Korea. He's co-editor of North Korea Economy Watch, and he writes regularly on North Korean affairs. I'm Rensley, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and a principal investigator of the current project. So, Artyom?
Yeah. Thank you, Rens. Actually, it's my great honor and privilege to be here today at the Wilson Center, and thank you very much to Shihoko for hosting us here today. And of course, I would like to express my gratitude to the Foreign Policy Research Institute and Al Luxemburg. FPRI has been our American partner in this undertaking, and I think our project is a rare example of Russian-American collaboration. I think rare example these days. Probably, I hope that this project could contribute maybe just a little bit to more Russia-US understanding on complicated international issues. So I think together we Russian and American teams did quite a good job. And I'm also grateful to Carnegie Corporation, which provided financial support for this project. And last but not least, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Rance Lee. Actually, Rance was the main inspirator and instigator of this project, and he came up with the idea of this project 2 years ago when, even before North Korea moved into everyone's spotlight. So actually, Rance had a full vision, I would say. Well, the Russian part of the project was done by 8 scholars based in Vladivostok, Moscow, and Seoul. The Moscow guys are Georgy Tolaraya, who is next to me, Ilya Dyichkov, and Lyudmila Zakharova. And the Vladivostok group included myself, Leonid Kozlov, Andrei Gubin, Tamara Troyakova, and Igor Tolstokulakov, who are all scholars at Far Eastern Federal University. And we also have on board Andrei Lankov, a Russian scholar who is currently based in Seoul. So I think our team was perfectly balanced, both in its geographic representation and with respect of of age and experience, including both seasoned and relatively young researchers. And as Rance and Alan said, this project examines political security and economic links between Russia and North Korea. I can say with confidence that this report is probably, is the most in-depth and comprehensive study of Russia-North Korea relations ever produced since the end of the Cold War, both in English and in Russian. And of course, it's more relevant and timely as it aims to assess Moscow's potential role and contribution to the resolution of the Korean nuclear and missile crisis. And probably you are aware, or maybe not, but let me emphasize it once again. Since the late 19th century, Russia has been a major stakeholder in Korean affairs, at times exercising critical influence on the peninsula. And the current unfolding crisis over Pyongyang's nuclear programs may again significantly raise Russia's profile on the peninsula. So what makes Russia a consequential player in the North Korea drama? Just to remind you, the Soviet Union helped create the DPRK, or I would even say the Soviet Union, to a significant extent, created the DPRK. And common genesis and long-standing political ties explain some of the affinity that to this day exists between the two countries. Well, speaking of the economy, Russia's economic leverage with the North, of course, it's not as substantial as China's, but it still can make a difference, especially now as the sanctions news on the DPRK tightens. And in this regard, of special note are Russia's energy exports to the North, Russia's importation of North Korean labor, and Russia's use of the North Korean port of Rajin. And Russia remains the only country besides China that provides DPRK with permanent transportation and telecommunications links via land, sea, air, and the internet. So Russia helps connect the isolated nation to the outside world. So taken together, such commercial and infrastructure links constitute, not an insignificant leverage that Moscow could exercise if and when it decides to do so. And last but not least, among the major players on the peninsula, Russia currently enjoys the best relations with the North, or to put it in a different way, the least hostile relations with the North. And probably the most final thing, which many people forget, but I would like to remind you about that. Russia is a military force in Northeast Asia, which means that in the case of a North Korea contingency, Moscow has the capacity to intervene militarily, aiding or derailing moves by other players. So what are the drivers of Moscow's North Korea policy? Well, I would say that Moscow's policy on North Korea is defined by a complex mix of motives and interests. Of course, Moscow sees North Korea's nuclear and missile programs as a serious menace to regional and global security. The Russians do not feel threatened, directly threatened by Kim's nukes, but its continued nuclear development could lead to a chain reaction of horizontal nuclear proliferation and will inevitably devalue Russia's own nuclear deterrent, which Moscow sees as an essential attribute of its great power standing. And that said, Russia's commitment to non-proliferation, is not the absolute imperative, and it needs to be balanced against Moscow's other interests, such as its reluctance to undermine the Pyongyang regime and Russia's opposition to what Russia perceives as the US hegemony. Well, on North Korea, Russia has closely collaborated with China. Even though Russia's interests on North Korea are not identical to China's, there is significant overlap. I would say there is sufficient overlap between Russia and China and North Korea to set up, effective coordination between them on this issue. Frankly, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, they seem to feel little sympathy for Kim Jong-un, who openly defies not only Washington, but also Beijing and Moscow. However, Russian and Chinese aversion to Kim Jong-un and his nukes is eclipsed, overshadowed by their shared animosity to what they perceive as the US pretensions to global and regional hegemony. And just to remind, the Russia-China collaboration in Northeast Asia is just one element of their so-called comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination, which under Trump has only grown tighter. And Moscow is unlikely to do anything on the peninsula that would run counter to Beijing's core interests there. The Kremlin is well aware that Korea is vital for China's security, and Moscow acknowledges that Beijing has much higher stakes in Korean affairs than Moscow does. So what Moscow expects in return for its understanding of Chinese interests, I think actually that's my speculation. Of course, I can't read Putin's mind, but I think there might be some kind of tacit agreement between Russia and China that Moscow defers to Beijing on Northeast Asian issues like the Korean issue, while in return the Chinese recognize Russia's leading role in the Middle East, and China acknowledges Russian interests in other regions which are of paramount concern to Moscow, such as Ukraine and maybe even Central Asia. Speaking of Russia and the US, there is no denying that Moscow could be tempted to use its leverage, its supposed leverage in the North Korea crisis as a bargaining chip vis-a-vis Washington. The Kremlin has never explicitly linked its potential assistance with North Korea to some US concessions on issues important to Russia, like removing of anti-Russia sanctions or Ukraine. Yet Washington can hardly expect Russia's enthusiastic cooperation on North Korea as long as US-Russia relations remain extremely hostile. How about other Russian interests and motives with regard to North Korea? I think we should also pay attention to Russia's traditional concern with its great power prestige. Simply put, Russia wants to be at the table whenever a major issue of international politics is decided, especially if this problem, like North Korea, is very close to Russian borders. And apart from traditional great power pride, Russia earnestly wants to be seen as a responsible and constructive player on the world stage. Economically, the settlement of the peninsula problem can potentially bring Russia sizable payoffs. If sanctions on North Korea are removed, Russia will be able to conduct full-scale commerce with North Korea. So people in my home city, Vladivostok, will be very happy. And the easing of tensions on the peninsula will also make possible the realization of grand so-called trilateral projects among Russia, the North, and the South, like the connection of the Trans-Korean Railway with the Trans-Siberian, or the construction of a gas pipeline from Russia to the Korean Peninsula. Well, Russia also has some normative things which define its behavior on North Korea. Russia regards the sovereign state as the primary foundation of international order, so Russia, as a matter of principle, rejects interference into internal affairs of states aimed at regime change. So even Russia may not like the North Korean regime, but as a matter of principle, Russia is firmly against any attempts at regime change. And speaking of Russia's vision for a Northeast Asian regional order, which is also important to understand Russia's stance on North Korea, Moscow seeks a multipolar balance of power system in Northeast Asia, with itself as one of its key stakeholders. And that's one reason Russia continues to favor resumption of the six-party talks, seeing them as a prelude to the establishment of a concert of powers type of institution in charge of Northeast Asian security. And I would argue that Russia is probably the most enthusiastic champion of the six-party talks, which are, of course, stalled right now. With regard to prospective reunification of Korea, Russia does not see unification as either desirable or possible, at least in the near term. Yet in the long term, Russia would welcome the emergence of a united Korean state, provided the unified Korea is not subordinate to the United States or China. And this preference, even though a long-term preference for a unified Korea, sets Russia apart from China and Japan, which frankly do not wish to see a unified Korea, at least it seems to me. But the US might prefer a unified Korea, and in the long run, it is not inconceivable that the US would value even a non-aligned Korea, especially if America shifts to something like an offshore balancing grand strategy. So this leads to potential convergence of Russian and US interests on the future of Korea. So what could be Russia's role in resolving the current Korea crisis? There is an idea, and I think Dr. Talarai will speak more about that, that Russia could play as an honest broker in the crisis. And I think Dr. Talarai will give more arguments on that. So I would like, I think my time is running out, I would like to say a few words about Russia's relationship with the US on the unfolding crisis around North Korea. As I said, in contrast to the Russia-China cooperation in North Korea, there is so far very little collaboration, at least visible collaboration between Moscow and Washington, even despite the fact that the two sides share a vital interest in maintaining the global non-proliferation regime. And as I said, and as all of you understand, the toxic relationship the toxic atmosphere which currently exists between Washington and Moscow is not conducive to dialogue over North Korea, let alone coordinated action. But meanwhile, the cost of mutual misunderstanding or miscalculation on North Korea could be extremely high. There are concerns, for example, about what might happen if the US tries to intercept North Korean ICBMs over the Russian Far East. Or what happens if Russia, possibly in coordination with China, militarily intervenes in a North Korea contingency. And historical precedents should not be forgotten. Korea is the place where Russians and Americans had the most violent direct collision ever in their history of their bilateral relations, with Soviet and US warplanes battling in the skies over the peninsula during the Korean War in 1950-53, when the Soviet Union provided air cover to North Korean and Chinese troops. And maybe such doomsday scenarios may not seem likely at the moment, but they're not impossible and should not be ignored. In case of North Korea, Russia and the US are parties to the most dangerous crisis since the end of the Cold War. And in this standoff, Moscow and Washington are not direct opponents so far, but neither are they true partners. They can choose to cooperate in resolving the situation, or they can obstruct each other's efforts. As I said, both the Russians and Americans share one fundamental interest in non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So, as the most basic common denominator, Moscow and Washington should collaborate to prevent horizontal proliferation of North Korean nuclear technologies and materials, such as attempts by the North Korean regime or its individual rogue representatives to sell nuclear components to other states or non-state actors. So Moscow, Washington, and other interested parties like Beijing or Tokyo or the EU, they need to deal with this risk of proliferation from North Korea without blockading North Korea, since a forced physical isolation of the DPRK is unacceptable to Russia and, of course, to China. Our suggestion is that a mechanism of permanent US-Russian consultations and exchanges on the Korean Peninsula, security problems needs to be established to address non-proliferation and other concerns related to North Korea. I think my time is up. Thank you very much.
Jordi?
All right. First of all, I would like to thank the Wilson Center and Foreign Policy Research Institute and Carnegie Foundation for arranging this project, which I think is very timely. And especially today, when we had the test, the missile test, just the day before yesterday, and I was in Seoul at that time and witnessed the reaction of the people at that. So I think it's very timely to discuss if Russia and US can cooperate on North Korean nuclear missile threat, and what is possible and what is not. First of all, I would like to start, in addition to what Art said, about how Russia perceives the North Korean nuclear threats, and actually we have several, I would say, school of thoughts in our political establishment. The most influential group are the non-proliferation experts and people who see North Korea as just an important issue to be discussed internationally with our major partners like China, US, and other countries, because they understand and everybody understands that North Korean problem cannot actually be solved in a way that would satisfy everybody. But keeping the dialogue on it is important, and it shows Russian concern, and it also corresponds to our basic principles. Therefore, North Korea is not exactly in the focus of attention of that group of experts, while the area experts who deal with North Korea, who deal with this regime for years, if not decades, they take into account the need to somehow consider North Korean interests, or what is considered to be the legal interests of North Korea, because unless you address them, these interests, you cannot really count on any progress, on any positive shift in the situation, which is becoming more and more dangerous. I wonder if North Koreans have now declared that their state nuclear force is completed, whether it gives a room, gives a window opportunity for starting some kind of some kind of discussion and direct dialogue between U.S. and North Korea. Because how we perceive it in Russia so far, the Trump administration policy have been much of a continuation of the strategic patience policy. So the tensions were increasing. Well, many words and tweets were exchanged. But anyway, the tendency of North Korea developing without hindrance their nuclear and missile capabilities, without U.S. being not able to do anything about that, it continued. So now I believe we almost came to a point where there are actually what we call binary choice, either to go to war or to try to find a compromise. And since everybody agrees that it's just impossible to see a war option, a military option, or a military decision as any kind of decision, because it's not an option. You cannot solve North Korean problem by that. Well, you can solve it by eliminating the country itself, destroying the country, and not only this country, but also neighboring areas, including South Korea and Japan. So this is not a solution. Therefore, the only choice that remains is to look for some compromise. Even if some kind of kinetic scenario would take place in Korea, like shooting down the North Korean missile, and North Koreans answering symmetrically by shooting down a U.S. plane or sinking a ship, still that would raise tensions, that would underline the price for a conflict, but still it will make the need for the dialogue and looking for a compromise more urgent. So how Russia can play a role in this? From this perspective, I think, and Art had mentioned it, Russia is what we like to translate as honest broker, but actually a sort of neutral observer who can cooperate with all the parties of Korean conflict, unlike anybody else, and deeply understands not only the interests and intentions of its Western and Japanese and South Korean partners, but also of North Korea, which is not so fully understood by many others, I believe. To see why it is so, it's necessary to know some history, because as I have mentioned, Soviet Union has actually created North Korea, and now that Russia can no longer dominate and has no intention to interfere into North Korean affairs, of which North Korea suspects China. Russia is seen by the North Koreans as a less suspicious foreign country, and at the same time a sort of a window to the world. Window to the world both in civilizational aspect, because most of North Korean, what I say, pop culture was created based on Soviet standards, and also a window to the Europe-led international world, and thus we have actually a soft power which is underestimated in most other places. And I would also tell you frankly, and it was well confirmed once again just the day before yesterday in Seoul by our Deputy Minister Margulov, that we keep the communication channels with North Korea open, and that we exchange both ideas and opinions on what's going on and how it can be held. Of course, it doesn't mean that anybody, including Russia or China, can persuade North Korea. No, North Koreans cannot be persuaded to sacrifice their national interests, or what they see as national interests, and they do not digest criticism too good. So we try to avoid it, but we're trying to show to North Koreans that some options are better than others, and I think they do understand the logic of it. As I said at the beginning, I think it's crucial that now we have to use all the opportunities for starting some kind of meaningful dialogue between North Korea and the U.S., because North Koreans see U.S. as the only viable partner, the only major actor they want to talk about the future, and this is understandable. And the six-party format, which is important for us, can only be supplementary unless any kind of solutions are not found on U.S. DPRK track. Nothing will work. And here come some kind of contradictions between Russia and China, between Russia and USA, because what we get from US on North Koreans are demands for more sanctions and to line up for more pressure of North Korea. And I've seen some publications making Russia responsible for North Korean crisis because Russia supports North Korea and defends it. We do not, but we do understand the logic of North Koreans' behavior, and we are trying to explain that to our partners. And one of the explanations I want to mention again is that sanctions actually do not work. And I think that the sanctions is the exercise mostly for public opinion of the West, and now China, just to show that we are doing something, because everybody really related to this issue understand that sanctions hit only and mostly the population. I've been to North Korea. I regularly travel to North Korea, and I've been there last about a month ago. And I see that the sanctions are hitting the most vulnerable parts of population, because due to sanctions, miners are out of work. The textile workers are out of work. Fishermen have to lessen the activities. So these are the ordinary people who are getting hit by the sanctions, while the regime, the government, the military-industrial complex continues its activities, and you cannot expect North Korean government to stop this course, to reverse it just because of sanctions. That is clear to everybody related to the problem. So I think that in coming days we'll see more of the demands for sanctions, and we have already seen the Ambassador Haley's speech yesterday that this is what the U.S. will demand from its partners. But there's a limited number of options and means to do this. Actually, we are talking now about oil embargo, as if it would help solve the North Korean nuclear program. Well, I'll tell you that, of course, North Koreans are dependent on the oil and fuel, but at the same time, they have accumulated some strategic reserves for military use. And if the oil is no longer delivered, well, that means means that they'll have to walk on foot. They have to use bicycles. They have to carry the cargoes by oxen and by trains and other means. So they're getting back to the 19th century. But anyway, they will survive. As President Putin said it during one meeting, they would rather eat grass than refrain from their nuclear activities. And this is true. And you really cannot do anything about North Korea by sanctions, because even if there would be a huge humanitarian crisis and God forbids there'll be no famine and people would die in North Korea, still that will make the regime even more hell-bent on continuing their militarization and their activities. Therefore, we should think again that sanctions are useful as a sort of coercive diplomacy, but at the same time they do not solve the problem by themselves. So there should be something else, and this is something else is dialogue. Russian idea, and we shared this opinion with China, and we suggested the so-called roadmap, which starts from a double freeze or double suspension. And I think that now it gets some understanding in some quarters of US as well. What is important about the freeze, and is important now that North Koreans have declared that they sort of completed their push for nuclear weapons, although it remains to be seen how reliable this weapon is, and mostly it's not yet operational. But anyway, it's now the chance is to freeze this activity and to stop further tests, further development of nuclear weapons, further development of missile technologies, in exchange for some kind of concessions from the US side. This shouldn't necessarily be in concessions in the form of sustaining or reducing the military exercises in South Korea. Maybe there could be other concessions or other sorts of suggestions, and that should be discussed. And Russia is ready to offer its good offices for that, because I think this way of dialogue is the most important means, if not to improve the situation, then to not to let it worsen. The most important thing about these suggestions that by starting the dialogue and freeze, we just conserve this conflict. So we can conserve it for some time to come, and and it wouldn't get worse. One thing I would like to add is that my observation of the last several years shows that the North Korean economy is in fact improving. The unleashing of the market forces have really made it possible for North Koreans to actively work in the market sphere, to produce more food, to produce more goods, to trade, to engage in business. And this is also attributed to Kim Jong-un's guidance. So Kim Jong-un is now enjoys authority, and both within elite and within the population. And there are no signs that his power base may be undermined. So any ideas that the regime would collapse soon that would help solve the problem, I think are not well grounded. So what we have to deal with, we'll have to deal with Kim Jong-un regime for some time, and we'll have to deal with nuclear possessor state for some time to come. And I think this is the reality we both should face. And I believe that the Russia-US dialogue on this is very important. Thank you.
7 minutes. Okay. Well, Ben and I both have the unenviable position, I think, of having to comment on these two reports that we're discussing today, and it's unenviable because I think it's very hard to follow two reports that are so detailed and in-depth, and also a series of experts who are, I think, as better placed as anyone to comment on Russia-North Korean relations and also the broader North Korean nuclear missile question or crisis. We can debate, I guess, how we call it. I'd like to give 3 points today that illustrate some ongoing dilemmas that the United States and Russia face in looking at how to resolve or how to address the North Korean question, which I think are follow on from the comments we've heard earlier, issues that the United States and Russia don't see eye to eye on and would need to be addressed in advance of any sort of broader cooperation on tackling the North Korean question. The first of those, and this is something that comes through, I think, the report that Professor Tolaraya and also Professor Lukin wrote, are continued disagreements on questions of fact between U.S. and Russian experts with regards to North Korean capabilities on both the nuclear question and on the missile question. And there are obviously many issues around the world where the United States and Russia disagree, but I think the difference between the expert communities in Russia and the U.S. on capabilities of North Korea are far more significant than the differences between the expert communities in the US and Russia on many other issues. So for example, how far can missiles travel? How many do the North Koreans have? What are the capabilities of the North Koreans in terms of testing various types of nuclear devices? Not just recently, but over the past decade, if not longer, there have been persistent disagreements as to what the North Koreans can do and what they'll be able to do in the future. And we're used to seeing this at the governmental level, where governments disagree about what is and is not possible. What's interesting and I think challenging in the North Korean situation is that also at the expert level, there are persistent disagreements about capabilities, which leads to very different threat assessments. And that leads into, I think, a second dilemma that's faced by Americans and Russians looking to work together potentially in North Korea, which is, again, a question of threat assessment. In Russia, there's almost no one who thinks that the North Korean regime is irrational and willing to try a first strike or willing to provoke South Korea or Japan or the United States into starting a war. Whereas in the United States, that's not the unanimous opinion. If you listen to the statements of several people in the Trump administration that have been reported to the media over the past several months, you hear concern that, in fact, the North Koreans can't be trusted with a nuclear capability precisely because they might, by accident or by some sort of deliberate measure, stumble into a nuclear conflict. And so here, too, I think you see very different threat assessments as to what is the risk to a North Korean nuclear program, what is the risk to a missile program, and how risky is it if these programs keep developing over time. Because in the mainstream Russian view, both I think in the expert community and certainly in the government level, the North Korean government is seen as rational, and so there's no chance that it would start a war with a power like the United States, which, as Professor Tolroy mentioned, could totally destroy North Korea. Whereas in the United States, there's far less certainty, it seems to me, at the governmental level at least, on that question, which shapes American threat perceptions as to what we're willing to tolerate in North Korea. And a third and final issue I would highlight is the broader regional question, which again I think has been a persistent challenge in the United States and in Russia in terms of how to collaborate over North Korea. From the perspective of the United States and also its allies in South Korea and Japan, the natural response to improve North Korean military capabilities and also North Korean provocations has been to tighten their alliance and build up military capabilities both in the Korean Peninsula and also in Japan. So for example, we've seen over the past couple of years increasing missile defense deployments both in South Korea and in Japan. We've seen, if anything, tighter alliances between the United States and Japan, and even with the United States and South Korea, despite the best efforts of our president, the alliance actually seems to be surprisingly resilient, given the concern about North Korea right now. From the Russian perspective, closer ties between the United States and Japan, the United States and South Korea, is not a goal. In fact, the opposite is a goal. Russia would rather see a more looser set of relationships that it can better take advantage of. And in particular on the question of missile defense, there's great concern in Moscow that efforts to bolster missile defense, which from the perspective of Washington and Tokyo and Seoul is seen as a regional question related almost entirely to North Korean missiles. In Moscow and also in Beijing, that's seen as a much broader question related not only to Pyongyang, but also to what is perceived as a more global campaign to constrain Russia's ability to properly deter the United States. And so the very steps that are supported in Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo to defend against North Korea's growing missile capabilities are seen in Moscow in particular as a threat not only to the North Koreans, but also to the Russians. And so this, too, I think is a dilemma, particularly since in the United States, support for improving missile defense capabilities in the Korean Peninsula is pretty close to universal, whereas in Russia, this is almost universally seen as something that is destabilizing on the Russian-U.S. bilateral level and also problematic in the Northeast Asian region in particular. So these are three dilemmas that I think in no way contradict the spirit of the report that our three authors here have put together. But I think they are outstanding issues that would remain to be resolved if, in fact, there is to be any sort of closer U.S.-Russian understanding or collaboration on the North Korean question. And I think they do help to explain why such conversations over the past several decades have been so complicated, because these are reoccurring issues that, situation on North Korea itself and on the Korean Peninsula changes, but these dilemmas in U.S.-Russian relations seem surprisingly persistent. And I think if we're looking to think about how the U.S. and Russia can cooperate on North Korea in the future, one of the first steps would be figure out, are there ways we can get past these questions of fact, these differing threat perceptions, and also the question of what should the Northeast Asian order look like? because that on that question in particular, you have very different views, I think, in Washington than in Moscow.
Thank you. Ben?
7 minutes as well? Right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, and to all the organizers and to the authors of this report. It's really striking, I think, how much access to information the authors of this report has that you wouldn't really find anywhere else. So I think both for the focus of the analysis of the report, but also for just the vast amount of really interesting information and facts and figures that's in there, I highly recommend that you all read it. I want to pick up on, so try to bring in the North Korean perspective a little bit here. I think that if you, we've talked about, or the authors have talked about the sort of Russian interests and Russian abilities and capacities to deal with and be a partner on the Korean Peninsula with the United States. I think from the North Korean perspective, this is also a very timely report. I think we've seen, particularly in the past few years, very strong indications that North Korea is looking, perhaps more than ever before in the past few decades, to diversify its international economic relations. We see this both in the way that North Korean publications write about things like export dependence. As many of you may know, North Korea has, at least before the sanctions, earned a lot of export incomes from sending coal and other natural resources abroad to China. But I think it's pretty safe to say that there is a solid awareness in Pyongyang of why this might be a problem, and of why being so heavily dependent for crucial goods on China and one partner alone is very problematic. And this report also notes the increasingly heavy pressure by Beijing on Pyongyang. One of the clearest signs of this, I think, that we can see from the outside is the increase in gasoline prices in North Korea during the spring and summer and fall of this year. So, and the report also points out, which is crucial here, that in the past, especially in the past 2 years, there's been more of an ambition by Russia to increase economic ties with North Korea as well. In 2015 was announced as a year of friendship between North Korea and Russia. There's been lots of diplomatic and other exchange since. And the Russian Minister of Far East Development in 2015 said that Russia wants to increase trade with North Korea tenfold by 2020. And it's important to remember that 2015, when this statement was made, even though tensions have gotten worse since then, it was not by no means a year of peace and kumbaya on the Korean Peninsula, but nevertheless. So, Russia, as this report acknowledges, and as a lot of other news stories have come out saying in the past few months, might very well be a much bigger exporter of oil and other types of fuel to North Korea than is commonly acknowledged. And so even by official statistics, Russia is the second largest exporter of fuel and other types of oil products to North Korea. But according to a senior North Korean defector, North Korea might be receiving much more vast amounts of oil and other similar oil and other types of fuel from Russia. And so you note that, and I want to sort of, I guess we're saving most of the questions for the audience, but I want to pose just a general question here on how far this bond between North Korea and Russia, especially in economics and trade, can really go. You note and point out in this report that Russia is generally very skeptical of economic pressure and economic sanctions against North Korea. So, I mean, especially with the request yesterday by Nikki Haley that China cease all flows of crude oil to North Korea, which would, I mean, I personally believe that is very unlikely to happen. But if that were to happen, and if North Korea's external economic relations would become even more limited than they already are, I'd be really interested to hear what you think the chances are that Russia might step in and somehow try to alleviate that. We've seen a pattern in Chinese sanctions implementation over the past few years, and this has changed in 2017, but where China will go ahead with agreeing to UN sanctions against North Korea, but still sort of under the radar continue trade and other types of relations. And I wonder, I know that Russia tends to make it a point to argue that international agreements should be adhered to, but I wonder to what extent you think that it's possible that Russia might eventually begin to sort of creatively interpret sanctions frameworks and the like, and try to alleviate the pressure on North Korea, even when the rest of the world is going in the other direction. And yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ben. We have some questions from the audience. Yes.
Please wait till the microphone comes, please.
Yes. It's not on? Okay. Oh.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intel analyst and a former diplomat. The regime has killed about 4 atomic bombs worth of human beings in the last 4 or 5 decades. It's on course to kill another atomic bombs worth of human beings this decade. What is Russia doing to make sure that that doesn't happen?
Say it again.
Could you rephrase your question, probably?
The prison and prison camp infrastructure routinely executes, starves, and allows to die from disease several 100,000 people every decade. And an atomic bomb is worth about 250,000 people. So when you do the math, the regime has killed 4 atomic bombs worth of human beings, all of them North Koreans. And we'd like to see that that stops. And I'm wondering what Russia is doing to make sure that that stops.
Let me answer that. I'm not aware that atomic bombs killing people, but of course there is a widespread human rights violations and prison system which is very cruel. This is a fact, and Russia is not all that happy about that, of course. But simply by pressuring North Korea or trying to squeeze some kind of concession out of them won't help. And I believe that these practices and general liberalization of the regime may be achieved only if you would give the regime some kind of external security, if you would help it open, help it to cooperate in a more civilized manner with the world, and thus the need for repressions and the practice of repression would slowly diminish the way it happened in former Soviet Union, in other communist countries. And unfortunately, that won't happen tomorrow. But I think this is the only way that we can take. And I think that Russia would welcome any kind of cooperation on that track.
Yeah, go ahead. This is I'm Mike Billington. I'm with the Executive Intel.
Back there.
May I proceed? I'm sorry. I'm Mike Billington. I'm with the Executive Intelligence Review. Dr. Talaraya, I wonder if you could address sort of the broader issue of U.S.-Russia-China relations above the Korea question per se. You had with President Trump's visit to Asia a really very dramatic transformation of U.S.-China relations and the rather stealth connection between Trump and Putin in Vietnam and the subsequent calls. It's clear that Trump is rejecting absolutely the hysterical Russiagate stuff and insistent that we have to have the U.S., Russia, and China be truly collaborators and friendship. I would pose, and I'd wonder your view, that if we're going to convince North Korea that in fact Tillerson's 3 no's, no invasion, no forced regime change, that if they're going to believe it, it's only because they believe the U.S. and Russia and China are truly friends, not only regarding North Korea, but globally. And I'm wondering how you view that issue.
Well, I think that we, in general, Russia and China, Russia and U.S. still lacks cooperation on Asian issues, Asian affairs, and this non-meeting in Da Nang only will underline that fact. Although there is lots of issues to discuss, and Russia rather would see China doing what is a dirty job in Asia if there are some kind of claims that U.S. would like to present. But at the same time, we are still open for dialogue. And so far, it has been very stagnant, I would tell you frankly. I believe that the last official track 1 contact we have with on Korean issue was this Ambassador Yoon, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, and there were no meetings, official meetings since. So I think this is a shortcoming, and this should be it should be overcome. The idea that North Koreans would believe anybody, would trust anybody's declarations, I think it's not serious. And North Koreans have learned through their experience they cannot believe not only assurances but documents signed and sealed. And the latest case of they being released as a state sponsor of terrorism only sees them by there's a proof that you cannot agree on anything unless and believe that this agreement would hold unless you have some prominent force, prominent guarantee to support this agreement.
Thank you very much, Taisuke Mibai with the Atlantic Council. Nowadays, the increasingly critical question in America and the other part of the world is if the North Korea is deterrable, as the U.S. did during the Cold War period with the Soviet Union. And as I'd like to ask this question to the Russian panelists who came from a state which confronted with the United States and deterred and were deterred, during the Cold War. So if you can see the Kim Jong-un regime in North Korea, the Soviet Union, who had a Cold War with the United States, and if so, why you think so?
Okay, well, North Koreans are actually aiming at achieving what they call strategic parity with the United States, however clumsy that might sound. So to revert to the same amount of mutual deterrence USA had with the Soviet Union. And they actually want to formally end the Korean War. It's not yet ended officially, and North Koreans cite the hostile policy of the United States as a sign of intention of USA to destroy and win over North Korea finally. So what they want is now to recognize the reality and end the Korean War in an official manner by signing a peace treaty, and then revert to this kind of mutual deterrence you were talking about. I don't think that's really feasible, but you should take into consideration this North Korean thinking when you plan something with regard to this country. And I personally think that that kinds of nuclear balance of fear that we now have in Korean Peninsula would hold for quite a long time, and it may be the bad news for the non-proliferation regime or to global process and elsewhere, and to the global security system and multilateral governance system of the globe. But anyway, we cannot change that, and North Korean nuclear regime is here to stay, unfortunately. So we have to face the reality and think about the modalities of such, well, mutual deterrence as not a welcome option, but as the quite possible option.
Could I comment on that as well, or do you want to jump in, Artyom?
Yes.
It seems to me that there's two different deterrence questions. One is, can the North Koreans deter the United States from acting militarily against them? And the answer to that seems to be yes, although one of the dilemmas in understanding deterrence is that you only know when it fails. It's hard to know when it's succeeding. But there's a second deterrence question, too, which is that now that the North Koreans apparently have the capability of hitting the mainland United States with a missile and potentially with down the road miniaturizing that and whether it could be deliverable in a confident way, will that affect how South Korea and Japan interpret U.S. defense commitments? And that, I think, is the really hard question to answer. That's also why the United States and also its allies in the region have been trying to put more missile defense and other types of military capabilities in the region to make sure that South Korea and Japan don't feel like their behavior has to change given increasing North Korean capabilities. And so that's where I see the really tough dilemma, actually, is because neither Seoul nor Tokyo nor Washington want to have to change their behavior, have to feel like they can't respond in a future North Korean provocation. And that's where the most recent missile tests really potentially do change the balance. That's the really tough deterrence question I think we need to be thinking about right now.
May I have to finger
Renz?
Mr. Chair?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Renz,
Just to finger, Robert. Yes. I normally do not say that publicly, and that doesn't reflect in official positions. But I believe that this military balance in Korea will keep, and well, the best, not the best, but the possible choice is to reintroduce U.S. nuclear tactical weapons into South Korea and Japan. To keep the balance like it was for many years after the Korean War. And well, nothing happened, and nobody actually wants to attack North Korea. North Korea is not going to attack anybody, but at least that would keep North Koreans from possible provocations against South Korea, against not impossible, not unimaginable attempt to unify the Korea by force now that they think that they're immune under this nuclear umbrella. So the military balance would be on a high level and more dangerous, but I think it will keep.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Gil Rosman, the Assad Forum. My question is about the notion of compromise after the dual freeze or suspension. What thoughts on the Russian side exist about how to deal with the demands likely to come from North Korea by eliminating the sanctions right away, moving towards a peace regime right away while North Korea maintains its threat capacity. So in other words, is Russia prepared to put pressure on North Korea in order for it to move to the next stage rather than just essentially accepting North Korea as a nuclear power and assuming reassurance to North Korea is the main way forward rather than more deterrence, more pressure to be relaxed in stages as North Korea shifts its behavior. And on this process, many think that China seems more willing to accept continued and substantial pressure on North Korea in this process than Russia might be. And so I want to hear more about Russian thoughts about pressuring North Korea in order to move from suspension to a more serious compromise.
Well, I'm of cynical opinion that the suspension by itself is a great achievement, that once you just stop sliding towards the abyss, once you stop this worsening of situation and tension, that would be a good thing, and it can continue for as long as possible. And of course, any kind of improvement of the situation would be welcome. But anyway, this is better than when the increase in tension and going closer to war. So answering questions, of course. I don't think that any kind of dialogue or negotiations or during the freeze would come to any good results soon. On the contrary, I believe that the position of the parties are so different that there's a very difficult. It will be very difficult to find a common ground, and in fact, these negotiations would just conserve the conflict, not solve it. But it is possible to discuss different modalities with the sanctions and with the North Korean demands, as well as the opponent's demands, and Russia would love to play a positive, constructive role in that. Pressure if needed, but not only pressure. I think that Russia's more constructive role would be in more demand.
Yes. Yes, over there.
Thank you. I guess I should have asked my question when there was a microphone standing right next to me. I apologize. I'm Steve Hirsch. I'm a freelance journalist. This question may be to Mr. Lukin, but maybe to everybody. I'm wondering whether Russia's attitude toward North Korea should be viewed solely within a bilateral and a non-proliferation context, or whether it should be viewed in any way as part of an overall Russian attitude towards Asia and its Asia policy as a region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Actually, in our report, we are making exactly this point, that Russia's attitude towards North Korea should be considered in the general context of Asian or Eurasian politics. So Russia sees its relationship with North Korea very much as Russia's assets in Asia, in Northeast Asia. That's one reason why relationship with North Korea is important to Russia. Russia wants to be a key player in Asia, especially in Northeast Asia, and to be a major player in Northeast Asia, we need to have strong positions on the peninsula, and to have strong positions on the Korean peninsula, we need to have good relations with North Korea. And this is also the question which pertains to how Russia views a future Northeast Asian order, and Greece has already mentioned it. Actually, there are principal cardinal disagreements between Russia and the US on the structure of Northeast Asian regional order, whereas the US wants to perpetuate its kind of political military hegemony in Northeast Asia. Russia strongly prefers a multipolar balance of power or concert-like arrangement in Northeast Asia with itself as a major player. So Russia, I think, is really playing a long game with North Korea, keeping in mind its preferred vision for Northeast Asia and Eurasia as a whole. Yeah. Well, actually, I think, frankly, when it comes to Russia's position in Asia, well, we are almost absent from Southeast Asia. Yeah, of course, our relations with South Asia are also quite, limited. Well, so Northeast Asia, well, probably Dr. Talarai would disagree with me, but Actually, Northeast Asia is the only area in Asia where Russia is a really strong player and where Russia really has a voice and both physical presence and leverage. So Northeast Asia is really important to Russia, and this is the place where Russia can really make a difference in Asia.
May I add? Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Georgia wants to.
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
just. Well, I might a little bit disagree with my friend because, well, now the whole of Asia is becoming a sort of arena for competition, and Russia is no stranger to that. Some scholars in Russia said that the coming century will see the break of the world into two blocks: Eurasian bloc comprising Russia and China, and there, well, other countries, and Pacific and Atlantic bloc. So the latest President Trump visit to the region, and especially the Indo-Pacific concept, the Quad concept of sort of alliance against China, where India is seen as a part. India is a part of South Asia, and it's a very important partner for Russia, of course. So this kind of division lines being drawn in Asia as a whole, and this in Indo-Pacific. I think this is a tendency that cannot be easily overturned. And in this regard, unfortunately, North Korea comes as an element which is not very conducive to this process, but still it's a part of them, and it comes into the overall Russia's understanding, Russian understanding of this confrontation and turning from competition to confrontation tendency in Asia and the Pacific that we would like to arrest, that we would like to oppose, but nevertheless, this is what's happening.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Thomas Julian. I teach a course in the history of nuclear policy for the Air Force Institute of Technology. Mutual deterrence has been mentioned both by gentlemen on the platform and in back. In an extreme situation, given the rhetoric of the administration in many ways, and its reluctance to accept the idea of an invasion, how would Russia react to the idea that as part of the strengthening of the alliance with Japan, the U.S. Undertook to publicly note that in the interest of mutual deterrence, it would support the development of a Japanese nuclear capability. The Chinese, it has been stated in this fora, different fora here, certainly would not want that. But what would the reaction of the Russians be and their perspective thought about North Korea's reaction to such a situation?
Okay. So if I got your question right, you're asking how Russia might react to potential nuclearization of Japan, yeah, and possibly of South Korea. Of course, Russia would be unhappy with the further nuclearization of Northeast Asia, but I think such a scenario is not inconceivable to Moscow. I guess that under certain conditions, Moscow might, come to terms with Japan and South Korea going nuclear, especially if such a development makes Japan and South Korea, more self-reliant in terms of security and thus less dependent on the U.S. So if it makes Northeast Asia more, independent from the U.S. in terms of strategic security, that might not be that might be acceptable to Russia. And to remind, the Soviet Union did accept a nuclear Maoist China back in the 60s and 70s, even though the Soviet Union's relations with China were frankly terrible back then. Yes, we have some issues with Japan, but they are probably not as serious as our relations were with Maoist China 40 years ago. So theoretically speaking, it's conceivable to me that Russia might accept nuclear South Korea and Japan in the long run. Yeah, thank you.
You want to make?
No.
Yeah, okay. Actually, I have a question I wanted to ask either of you guys. Looking at Russia-China relations over the long term in North Korea, would it be possible if those Trans-Korea projects become a reality and have Trans-Korea railroad, pipelines, electricity transmission, all that, would that not greatly increase Moscow's influence in North Korea and also create a situation in which China and Russia might be rivals for influence in North Korea, looking down the road, of course?
All right. Well, this idea of trilateral projects, trans-Korean projects, has long been suggested by Russia because it's obviously would greatly contribute to the development of the Far East, which constantly complains that Moscow doesn't pay enough attention on the Far Eastern needs and doesn't invest in this area. So both the gas pipeline, the railroad projects, and the electricity grid connection, they're now discussed still, especially between Russia and South Korea. As President Moon, being recently in Vladivostok, has suggested to put into to discuss these issues, and now South Korean government has developed a concept they call Korean New Economic Map, which includes that kinds of projects into cooperation between North Korea and Russia and South Korea. Of course, so far it's just, these are just the pipe dreams, because without lifting political tensions, nothing will happen. But anyway, as a long-term prospect, I think it's one of the key Russian goals on Korean Peninsula, and the real sense of this project are not increasing our influence in North Korea, but increasing the possibilities for integration, Northeast Asia integration economic projects. And of course, China can be a lean to that. And by the way, the new Korean economic map, which is mentioned before, it also sees for the need for Chinese cooperation and Chinese involvement. And we presume that, of course, China's economic positions in the integrated Korean peninsula would be much stronger than Russia's. But we'll still have our own piece of pie, and I think the pie would be big enough to share. And I don't see much of a competition between Russia and China on this issue. At least not much more than in Central Asia and other more vital areas, which has much more tradition of Russia's influence.
Ken Meyercourt, TV producer. If you accept that Israel has nuclear weapons and the capability to use them against Iran, is there any parallel between Russia and China's position of restraint as far as restraining North Korea and Europe's position with regard to Israel? Both feel secure in that the missiles are not aimed at them currently, but politics are a fickle thing. Israel has had tense relations with Europe from time to time. In fact, I think Ariel Sharon once warned that Israel had the capability to hit Rome. So are there any parallels there in the lack of Europe's lack of willingness to put any pressure on Israel to disarm their nuclear arsenal.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a 15-minute break now. Please be back at 11:15. Thank you.
Can we respond to the question, actually? No?
Do you want to respond?
Well, very briefly, yeah. If I got your question right, and as Chris said, there are different threat perceptions, different threat assessments. Russia does not feel directly threatened by North Korean nukes, and that's one reason why Russia's approach to North Korea is different from America's. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.